a place that America preferred to forget exists high in the mountains of western Virginia, where time seems to have halted in 1920 and the fog dances among ancient pines. Odd, a small rural Appalachian community has become synonymous with something modern society deems a complete taboo: generations of marriages between direct relatives. The road leading to the Whittaker family property is a narrow, uneven dirt path, bordered by rusty trailers and old wooden homes that defy gravity. Kilometers before you reach the destination, the GPS stops working. It is as if the very technology refuses to acknowledge this place's existence. In 2020, documentary filmmaker and photographer Mark Leiter ventured into these mountains with a single haunting question: how can an entire family survive decades of consanguineous marriages? What he discovered was a reality that defies all fiction. The Whittaker family is not merely an isolated case of consanguinity, they represent the devastating extreme of generations of absolute poverty, geographical isolation, and traditions that have been perpetuated for over a century. The genetic cost: the Whittaker siblings. The brothers and sister, Ray, Lorraine, Timmy, and Freddie Whittaker, bear the mental and physical marks of a genetic lineage that has closed upon itself. Ray, the eldest brother, suffers from severe physical malformations. His head is disproportionately small compared to his body, a condition known as microcephaly. With severely compromised intellectual capacity, he communicates only through gestures and grunts. Lorraine, the only sister, has obvious facial deformities and motor difficulties that prevent her from walking normally. Timmy has a severe intellectual disability, though he can speak a few words. His face displays the undeniable signs of consanguinity, serious dental problems, facial asymmetry, and a vacant look that speaks of decades of social isolation. Freddie, the youngest, is the only one who can sustain basic conversations, yet he too shows clear signs of cognitive impairment. The most shocking realization isn't only the visible physical deformities but the naturalness with which this family accepts their condition. This is the only reality they know. Their house contains no mirrors, no television to show other families, and no references from the outside world that could let them understand the depth of their difference. Their home is a collection of rooms lacking any modern comfort, no running water, no electric light. The smell of abandonment and mold saturates every corner. Mountains of accumulated trash from years of neglect clutter the backyard. It's impossible to tell where their personal belongings begin and the garbage ends. Check if you are already registered with this channel, because this is one of the most documented and extreme consanguinity stories ever recorded in the United States, and details like these are unavailable anywhere else. Roots of isolation: the Appalachian geography. To grasp how the Whittaker family reached this point, we must return to the 19th century, when the first settlers established themselves in western Virginia's isolated mountains. Extreme geographical isolation has always characterized the Appalachian region. Entire communities formed in deep valleys, separated by dense forests and impassable mountains. The geography here is merciless and brutal. Mountains that rise abruptly over 1,200 meters create narrow, isolated valleys where small communities develop their own language, traditions, and culture over generations. During the winter months, heavy snowfall can completely isolate these communities, forcing families to rely exclusively on one another for survival. Dr. Spencer Wells, a geneticist specializing in isolated populations, explains that the genetic pool becomes progressively more limited when small groups are geographically isolated for generations. What occurred in the Appalachians is a classic example of genetic drift in small founding populations, Wells notes in his research, published in the Journal of Medical Genetics in 2018. Wells further elucidates the concept of a population bottleneck. When a population is drastically reduced and remains isolated, the available genetic diversity is lost, starting a vicious cycle that ultimately leads to mandatory consanguinity. A century of forbidden unions. The history of the Appalachians is full of comparable examples. Many families migrated to remote valleys during the colonial era, seeking isolation from the federal government and greater autonomy. Many of these families carried with them ancient European traditions, including marriage practices that were considered problematic even then. The Whittaker family's roots are documented in the region dating back to 1887, when John Whittaker and his wife, Sarah, settled in Odd. American census records show that in the second generation, marriages began occurring between first-degree cousins. By the third generation, marriages between half-sisters and siblings had become a common, though not necessarily desired, practice, simply for an absolute lack of other options. The archives of the local Methodist Church, preserved in Charleston's historic library, reveal disturbing details about the religious formalization of these unions. Reverend Samuel Morrison, who served the community from 1920 to 1945, kept meticulous records of weddings, baptisms, and funerals. His personal diaries, discovered in 2019, contain passages describing his growing concern about the irregular unions he felt compelled to bless. In an entry dated June 23, 1934, Morrison writes, "Today, I performed the wedding of Mary Whittaker with her own brother, Henry. The girl is only 16 and already shows visible signs of mental disabilities. Henry is not much better. Both are children of a union between a father and daughter. May God bless them." These entries continue for years, documenting progressively more problematic marriages. Morrison records at least 12 unions between first-degree relatives within the Whittaker family between 1930 and 1940. Each entry reveals his increasing powerlessness in the face of a tradition that persisted despite his disapproval, alongside his personal anguish. The religious and genetic vicious cycle. The isolation was not just geographical, it was economic, religious, and cultural. The Whittaker family belongs to a fundamentalist religious sect that views the outside world as corrupt and sinful. Marrying outside the family was not just geographically impractical, it was considered a betrayal of religious and family values. This sect, known locally as the Church of the Elected, developed a peculiar theology that actually justified and even encouraged consanguineous marriages. Doctrinal documents found on the Whittaker property include manuscript sermons that interpret biblical passages as divine commands to preserve the purity of God's lineage. The genetic consequences became apparent in the fourth generation. Medical records from Charleston General Hospital, obtained through public information requests, show that at least 15 Whittaker children were born with severe disabilities between 1920 and 1950. 8 of them died before the age of 5. Prolonged consanguinity results in a phenomenon geneticists term inbreeding depression. Deleterious recessive genes, which typically remain inactive when a person marries a genetically distant partner, become dominant when both parents share the same genetic mutations. In the Whittaker family's case, genetic analyses performed by Dr. Michael Bamshad of the University of Washington revealed that the current siblings have a consanguinity coefficient of 0.355. This figure means they are genetically closer than normal siblings born of the same parents, suggesting their parents were themselves the result of multiple consanguineous relationships. Dr. Bamshad provides perspective on this number. A consanguinity coefficient of 0.375 is extraordinarily high. By comparison, the children of normal siblings would have a coefficient of 0.25. What we observe in the Whittakers points to at least 3 consecutive generations of reproduction between very close relatives. This level of consanguinity results in extreme homozygosity, a condition where virtually all deleterious recessive genes express themselves simultaneously. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a medical genetics expert at Johns Hopkins who has studied the Whittaker case, describes the situation as a perfect example of the worst possible scenarios in human genetics. Martinez continues, "What we see in the Whittakers is essentially the human equivalent of a highly inbred laboratory lineage. They have accumulated so many deleterious mutations that their survival to adulthood is a miracle. Their neurological development, immune system, bone structure, and cardiac function have all been compromised by this extreme genetic burden." Detailed genetic tests revealed that the Whittaker siblings carry at least 23 different recessive mutations in a homozygous state, all simultaneously expressed. In a normal population, the probability of a person carrying even 5 of these expressed mutations is astronomically low. The Whittakers represent a statistically impossible convergence of adverse genetic factors. Visible physical malformations are only the tip of the iceberg. Partial deafness, congenital heart problems, an extremely compromised immune system, and chronic kidney problems are part of these siblings' daily reality. Ray suffers from severe epilepsy, with crises lasting hours. Lorraine has respiratory problems that cause her to constantly gasp, as if she is always out of breath. The most disturbing aspect is that these 4 siblings are the survivors. Local church documents suggest that at least 7 other siblings were either stillborn or died in childhood due to life-incompatible malformations. Paradoxically, the 4 survivors are the less severe cases of a genetic lineage that should have become extinct decades ago. Institutionalized incest and neglect. The perpetuation of consanguinity in the Whittaker family cannot be understood solely as an individual choice. It is the result of a complex system of ignorance, poverty, and isolation that has been self-perpetuating for more than a century. Betty Whittaker, a distant cousin who managed to escape the community in the 1970s, offers a shocking testimony of the internal family dynamics. "No one explained anything to anyone," she told documentarian Mark Leiter in an interview. "The girls got pregnant by their own brothers, fathers, or uncles, and that was seen as normal. There was no sex education, no knowledge about genetics, no alternatives." Now 73 and living in a Charleston nursing home, Betty carries her own physical and emotional scars from life on the Whittaker property. She has minor deformities in her fingers and slight facial asymmetry, signs that she, too, is a product of consanguinity, though to a much lesser degree than her current cousins. "I was considered the normal one in the family," Betty recalls bitterly. "Being able to read a few words and do simple arithmetic gave me enough courage to escape when I was 19. I walked 15 kilometers down the mountain until I reached the main road, where a truck driver hitchhiked me to Charleston." Betty describes disturbing family rituals that demonstrate how incest was institutionalized within the family. There was a ceremony called the Blessing of Purity, held when a girl turned 14. The family patriarch, in her time, old Thomas Whittaker, chose which family man would be the girl's guardian. It didn't matter if it was her father, brother, uncle, or cousin. The girl had no choice. These guardians were given exclusive reproductive rights over the women assigned to them. Betty states that resisting this designation resulted in severe punishment, isolation in a dark basement, food deprivation, and in extreme cases, beatings that left permanent marks. "My younger sister, Rebecca, tried to escape 3 times, Betty tearfully remembers. The 3rd time, they broke her legs with a hammer to ensure she could never walk far enough to escape. She died at age 23, giving birth to her 5th son. All 5 babies were from our own father." Betty describes an environment where incest was not just tolerated but actively encouraged by family patriarchs as a way to maintain the lineage's purity and prevent family properties from being divided with outsiders. "Old John always said that Whittaker blood was pure blood, and mixing with others was sin," she recalls. Raleigh County Social Assistance records, obtained through public information requests, reveal that between 1960 and 2000, at least 23 Whittaker children were recorded with the same father listed on the birth certificates as mothers who were their own sisters or daughters. The legal system chose to simply ignore these irregularities, treating the family as a lost cause. If you also feel the weight of this story, comment now. How does a society allow this to happen for so many generations? The cycle continues. Formal education was never an option for the current Whittakers. Freddie, Timmy, Lorraine, and Ray never attended school. They cannot do basic math, write, or read. Their only knowledge of the world comes from conversations with equally ignorant and isolated relatives. For them, their condition is normal simply because it is the only reality they have ever known. The most tragic aspect is that the cycle continues. Despite his cognitive limitations, Freddie has had at least 2 relationships with first-degree cousins. One relationship resulted in the birth of a child who died at 3 months of age due to severe heart malformations. The second resulted in a miscarriage in the 5th month of gestation. Dr. Robin Bennett, a genetic counselor at the University of Washington, explains that when the consanguinity coefficient reaches the levels observed in the Whittaker family, the likelihood of severe birth defects and coat defects exceeds 50%. Statistically, it is more likely that a child will be born with severe problems than be born healthy. The family lives solely on government disability benefits, receiving about $800 monthly, barely enough to cover their basic needs. They rely on the charity of neighbors for clothing and food. Once a month, a local church van delivers basic groceries, canned beans, rice, old bread, and non-existent milk. The nearest health unit is 45 kilometers away, and the Whittakers have no means of social transport. They know no forms of entertainment other than sitting on the porch and watching the few cars pass by the dirt road. Their existence is silent and without perspective. Ghosts of Forgotten America. My initial reaction was pure shock, Leiter admits in an interview. But then, the astonishment came: how could a family in such extreme conditions have remained completely invisible to the authorities for so long? The road to the house is literally a path created by decades of use by a single family. When I finally arrived at the house, I thought I was looking at a horror movie scene, the photographer says. He initially had difficulty recognizing that he was looking at human beings. Ray was sitting on the porch, and honestly, my first thought was some kind of haunted doll or sculpture. When he moved and made those sounds, that's when I realized I was facing something I had never imagined could exist. Leiter attempted to establish basic communication, but he quickly realized the family's extreme limitations. Freddie was the only one capable of forming recognizable words, but even his answers were limited to no, yes, and a few loose words. I asked him how old he was, and he answered the lot. I asked him where he was born, and he pointed to the ground. The Whittaker family situation reveals profound systemic failures in American society. Raleigh County, where they live, is one of the most neglected and poorest regions of Western Virginia. With a population of only 78,000 spread over an area of 600 kilometers, social services are scarce and overloaded. Internal documents from the Department of Social Services, obtained through litigation for access to information, reveal that local authorities were aware of the Whittaker family's situation for decades but consciously chose to ignore it. It was not ignorance. It was a conscious political decision to treat the Whittaker family as a problem that simply did not exist. Documents reveal at least 8 social worker reports between 1985 and 2005 describing subhuman conditions on the Whittaker property. Each report recommended immediate intervention, and each report was filed without action by supervisors who considered the problem intractable and beyond resolution. Morrison, a social worker who worked in the region for 15 years, explains, there are hundreds of isolated families in these mountains living in precarious conditions. Resources are limited, and cases like the Whittakers require a type of expert intervention that is simply not available in poor rural counties. Educational and social failure. The educational system also completely failed the family. Western Virginia Education Department records show that school truancy control agents attempted to force the children to attend school during the 1980s. All attempts were frustrated by family resistance and the physical and mental condition of the children, often dirty, with a strong odor, and unable to communicate properly. The other children were afraid, and the teachers had no training to deal with such severe disabilities. The negligence was not limited to education. Local newspaper reports in the Charleston Gazette-Mail from 1995 and 2003 document at least 2 investigations by the Department of Social Services into improper living conditions on the Whittaker property. Both investigations resulted in reports that were filed without any concrete action. The 1995 report described subhuman living conditions, evidence of medical neglect, absence of basic sanitation, and possible sexual abuse. The Whittaker case exposes the hypocrisy of a society that is proud of its family values but completely abandons families that do not fit into normative standards. The local community itself has an ambiguous relationship with the Whittakers. Some neighbors show genuine compassion, occasionally providing clothes and food. Others view them as a local shame that should be hidden from external visitors, seeing the family's condition as a divine curse or the payment of ancestral sins. If this family is like this, it's because God has a purpose that we are not meant to understand. This fatalistic resignation permeated any attempt at external intervention for decades. The Whittaker family was not only forgotten by the system, it was actively ignored by a community that preferred to treat it as an invisible problem. A warning to society. The history of the Whittaker family transcends the sensationalism of extreme consanguinity. It illuminates the deep failures of the health and education systems, institutional negligence, systematic abandonment of marginalized populations, and American rural poverty. Subsequent genetic studies have revealed that the Whittaker family is not an isolated case in the Appalachian region. What makes the Whittaker case unique is not the consanguinity itself, but the extreme temporal duration and the complete absence of external intervention, Dr. Bamshad explains. They represent a natural experiment on the limits of human survival in adverse genetic conditions. Unfortunately, media attention has also transformed the Whittakers into a kind of human zoo attraction. Tourists began appearing on the property, taking videos and pictures as if they were animals on display. This additional exploitation has raised complex ethical questions about human dignity and consent regarding the most vulnerable aspects of their lives. Media attention did bring some practical improvements, however. Spectator donations have allowed minor house repairs, the installation of a generator for basic electricity, a functional bathroom, and more regular access to medical care. Lorraine, now 65, is developing progressive respiratory problems. They are literally the last of their species, a family that has reproduced itself toward extinction. But the Whittaker story also serves as a warning. Thousands of families live in conditions of extreme social, educational, and medical vulnerability in the poorest rural regions of America. Geographic isolation, combined with institutional negligence and poverty, creates conditions where similar tragedies can silently develop. Dr. Williams, a social anthropologist at the University of Virginia who has studied isolated Appalachian communities for 20 years, notes that the Whittaker family is not an anomaly. It is the extreme result of social trends that affect thousands of families in the region. Cultural isolation, multidimensional poverty, and government abandonment create ecosystems where human tragedies like this can be perpetuated for generations. Williams has documented at least 47 other families in the Appalachian region with significant consanguinity histories, though none has reached the extreme levels of the Whittakers. What we see is a vulnerability gradient, she explains. The Whittaker family represents the most extreme point of a spectrum of social neglect that affects the entire region. The parallels are disturbing. Families like the blue-skinned Fugates, caused by consanguinity, or the Hartwells, whose limbs suffer from hereditary cognitive disabilities and dwarfism, demonstrate that the Whittakers are not an isolated case. They are simply the most extreme example of a regional standard of isolation and inbreeding. Research led by the Appalachian Health Initiative reveals that consanguinity rates in isolated mountain communities can be 15 to 20 times higher than national averages. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, who leads this initiative, states, "We are dealing with a public health crisis that has been ignored for decades." The Whittaker family represents the most severe endpoint of what happens when economic desperation combines with social abandonment and geographic isolation. A mirror of collective conscience. The true lesson of the Whittaker family lies not in their deformed genetics but in what their existence reveals about the deep failures of a society that refuses to care for its most vulnerable members. They are an uncomfortable mirror, reflecting not only physical deformities but also the moral and social deformities of a system that leaves those who need protection the most behind. Dr. Bennett offers a dark final perspective. From a purely scientific perspective, the Whittaker family represents what happens when natural selection is artificially suspended. Under natural conditions, individuals with so many genetic deficiencies would not survive to reproductive age. What kept this family alive were not their genes. This persistence, however, comes at an immeasurable human cost. Every day in the lives of the Whittaker siblings is a struggle against limitations that no human being should have to face. Their existence is simultaneously a testimony to human resilience and a devastating accusation against a society that allows such suffering to be perpetuated. Today, as you watch this story comfortably at home with access to opportunities, health, and education, the Whittaker siblings remain in their home, without hope, without electricity, without a future. They are ghosts of an America that we prefer to pretend does not exist but continues, hidden in the forgotten folds of a country proud of its opportunities for everyone. The Whittaker family will die in silence, just as they lived. But their history will remain a permanent testimony to what happens when a society decides that some lives simply do not matter enough to be saved. They are the human price of institutionalized neglect, the genetic cost of social abandonment, and the living proof that some tragedies are entirely avoidable if we only cared enough to prevent them. Their lives pose a question directly aimed at our collective conscience. If a society is judged by how it treats its most vulnerable members, what does the Whittaker family's existence say about who we truly are? If you are not registered yet, subscribe now because stories like this reveal truths that few have the courage to tell. If you have watched this far, leave a comment saying I watched here so I can meet you and know who truly follows the channel. Leave your like if this story impacted you in any way. Share this video so that more people understand the realities our society prefers to ignore.